Hello everybody, welcome back to Bare Basic Tech. Today we're going to be talking about classes in Python. So classes are a foundational programming topic in the language as they tie into the object-oriented programming concept that Python is heavily based on. So having a strong understanding of this is pretty critical to being successful when using the language. So before I dive into all the code you see here, I want to go ahead and talk about conceptually how classes actually work. So let's say, to keep it simple, think of classes as essentially like a template or a cookie cutter. And then the objects that it produces would be the cookies that are cut by that cookie cutter, right? They are what comes out of a template. So I know a lot of times people teach this concept using a car as your template and then like a Ford as an object and a Toyota as another object and so on and so forth to kind of explain this. And in my opinion, I feel like it just gets a little complicated because people get carried away with all the many variables that come with cars, such as the engine or how fast it drives or all those kinds of things. And it gets a little bit, the point gets misguided, I think, unfortunately. And I know this is something that can definitely hang a lot of people up when first learning how to use classes effectively. So in this example, I'm just going to use a simple example of a square where it only has two variables for us to worry about. One variable being the color of the outline, the other being the weight. So notice that besides that, the objects that the class creates are going to be entirely the same, right? It's just the color and the weight as I mentioned. So understand like why this is important, right? So yes, you could write out the code for each of these three as I could show you, but this is important because if you had, let's say, 100 of these squares that you wanted to make in your code, that would take a lot of time to do. And it would be very unnecessary because the whole point of the class system is it can do that for you in a sense a lot more rapidly than you typing out everything. Also, if you were to, let's say, change some kind of an aspect that's common amongst all these, you could simply change that variable in the class itself, and then it would reflect in all the following objects that are based on this template. So again, just remember that the objects all ultimately are initialized from this template. The variables in here, yes, you can modify them as you want, but it's up to you. And as you'll see here, I give a couple examples. So the first object we have this red square, which its color variable is going to be red, and it will have the higher weight. Notice how it's more bold than the template. If you go on to the next variable, or the next object, you'll see we have the green square, which has a thin line and the green outline. So you'll notice how I write this here, I don't include the weight. And that's because if you don't include the weight in your object, it will use the default value when initializing, which in this case is weight of 1. If that doesn't make sense now, don't worry about it too much. Just I will go over it later as well, so that comes full circle, but just bear with me for now. And in this bottom example, similar concept, just for this one, we don't show the color. So it's going to use the default color for this object that was made, which is black. However, the weight, we specify that we want it to be 2. So instead of the default 1, which it would have gotten from this class, we're specifying instead, nope, make it 2. I want it to be heavier for this box. Okay? So now let's start to get into how we're going to code this or write this virtually, right? So the basic syntax for classes are as follows. You have this keyword, class, and then you would have the name of your class written here. So we're going to call it square to keep it simple. And then it's followed by this colon. Now underneath that indented, you would have any variables that you want. So let's just say, for the sake of this, variable 1 is integer 1, variable 2 is string variable 2. Now, on further lines of code, you would then go and initialize this object, right? Because this is ultimately a cookie cutter. Just remember that. This is all something that's completely virtual and doesn't really exist, so to speak, in your program yet because you haven't made an object for it. So it's like you haven't made a cookie with this cookie cutter. That's what this line of code would do, right? So we're going to take the square template or cookie cutter, and we're going to make an object out of it and reference it as square1. So that'll be the name of that object that came out of the square template. Now note here these parentheses. Just for now, understand these are very important to have for reference purposes. If you don't include those, basically, I'll show you why as I go through the code of it. But basically, if you try to write multiple squares, you'll end up throwing things that you don't want, where you'll basically, if you try to make multiple squares and you try to reference the different values in each of the squares, it'll get jumbled up together, because basically it won't understand that it's passing it as a reference to that square1 or square2. It'll just recognize them all as the same square. So that's why when you put these parentheses in, it gives square1 its own identity, its own memory reference, if you will. But again, I'll show you later so you can kind of make sense of that. So if we were going to go ahead and write the class here that we've just made with pseudocode into actual code, this is what it would look like, right? So you would start with class as your keyword, and then square would be the name of the class, followed immediately by a colon. On the next line indented, you would have your first variable, which is color, and we're going to set the default to black, and then weight, which is going to be defaulted to 1. So then on the next slide here, I'm going to show you how we're going to write the the pseudocode that we originally wrote into actual code. So we'll start with the red square. So again, here's the real code for the class. Remember, this has to come before this, right? Otherwise, when you initialize your object, it won't recognize what template you're trying to pull from. So in this example, we're going to make an object called square1. This is going to use the square template, or as we call it, class. We use the parentheses to make sure that this square1 has its own unique identity that can be referenced in memory later. And then if you want, you can go in and edit any variables that you want as so. So you'd essentially say square1 dot color equals red. So this dot, all that does is it goes into square1's variables, right? And then you can pick which variable you want to edit after you type that dot. So in this case, we type color to access square1's color, and only square1's color. So this won't affect any other squares if you do it like this. And then again, we set it to red. And then if you want to edit the weight, you would do the same thing, except after the dot, you would type weight and set that equal to 2. So going on to the green square, again, same thing. Here's the class. Now if we were going to convert the square, or the green square as pseudocode into real code, it would just look like this. Very similar, where you would have square2, because we're going to name it as its own square, would equal square, and then square2.color equals green. Now, again, note, I don't write square2.weight here, and this is because we want, in this case, the weight of this square to be the same as the class or the default, right? So if that's the case, we don't need to include or specify explicitly the weight that we want it to be 1, which is the same as this. You could, but it's inefficient, right? Now, some reasons you may want to do it that way, right? So let's say we end up writing like code for 100 squares, right? And a lot of them are default weights. But then we end up deciding, you know what, I actually don't like the default weight. Let's change it to like 3 or 4 or something. Well, instead of going through the code and having to rewrite for 50 different squares the code because you just changed your mind, all you have to do is you just change the class to be 4, and then it would update everything else that's based off of that default, right? So that's why you may not want to specify here, just in case you want it to be dependent on what the class or the default is. Now we go to the final example, which is just the black box with a thick border. So same concept or similar concept as square2, but we would name it as its own square. So square3 is going to be equal to the square class. We're going to make it its own object with its own memory. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to specify that we want a certain weight out of it, but we're going to keep the default color so we don't mention that. That's how we get this. So let's go ahead and let's see how this looks when we try it in the actual Python editor, right? So again, we define our class here, class square, color equals black, weight is 1. So that is going to be our default. So going back to here just to show you again, just like this, right? Very similar. So now we go on and we define square 1. So as we went over here, we write square 1, we set it equal to the class that we're making it from that template, right? And then we're giving it parentheses so that it's its own object with its own memory that can be referenced later. And then we go ahead, we change the color, we change the weight. That one's done. Go on to square 2. Square 2, we'll use the square class or template. We instantize it using the parentheses so it has its own memory. And then square 2.color is green. So we're specifying that we want it to actually be green, but we don't specify the weight because we want that weight to be the same as whatever the template says. That one's done. Go on to the final square, the black square. So now square 3, we're going to call it, uses the square class. We give it parentheses so that we make sure that it has its own memory. And then square 3, access square 3's weight and set it equal to 2, and that will give you that box. Right? So now if we run it and we just see what prints out as the value for each square's color and weight, we will get the following. So square 1, and I'll bring this up just to show you. Square 1 is red with the heavier weight. Square 2 is green with the lighter weight. And then square 3 is black with the heavier weight, right? Just as we intended. So just to show you too, right? Let's say, like I was telling you, if we want to change the default weight, right? Let's change it to 10, just to show you. So now you'll see here, square 2, its weight is now 10, right? Because again, we didn't explicitly set the weight here. So it's going to go off of the default here. Likewise, if I change the color to like blue, let's say, you'll notice that now square 3 is blue because square 3 was working off of the default set in the class. So now I'll go back really quick and just last thing I mentioned with the parentheses, right? So let's say I remove these. I'll show you what happens really quick so you guys don't make this mistake and you're banging your head on the table for hours trying to figure out where your error is. So if I remove all the parentheses and run it, you're going to notice something funny. Look at that. All the squares say the same thing, right? Now the reason for that is because it's basically going to go off of whatever the last set variable is that references the square class. So you'll notice in this case here where square 3.weight is 2, that is going to, or that is essentially going to set the value, right? And then green here would set the color. So it's kind of odd, but basically it takes the last known variable that references that class's value and it will set that to any object that was made from the square class. So essentially, if that sounds kind of complicated, just moral of the story is just make sure you use parentheses when you are making your objects. This way you don't have to worry about this kind of problem where, like I just showed you, every single object ultimately being the same exact thing. But that's all I have for you today, guys. I am going to make a part 2 because there's quite a bit more to this, honestly. I just wanted to give you guys the basics, but we will go more in depth in the future. But if you did like this video, please feel free to like and subscribe, and please feel free to give me some feedback. Thank you.